Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Back Porch Files. From your neighbor on the left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today, this one's going to be a little bit of a myth-busting session. Because every time the subject of the Iran nuclear deal comes up, someone eventually says the same thing. Obama gave Iran pallets of American taxpayer money. And when you try to explain the actual facts, you sometimes get that look. You know the one. The look that says, I already decided what the story is, and I'm certainly not interested in reality. Which is frustrating because the real story is actually pretty interesting. And it also says a lot about how political narratives get created. Now that we've started a war with Iran, ostensibly because we had to stop them from getting nuclear weapons, this nonsense story is out again in full force. So today we're going to walk through three things. First, what the Iran nuclear deal actually was. Second, where the billions of dollars to Iran claim comes from. And third, what the famous pallets of cash actually were. Because facts are facts, no matter how much they might annoy you. And once you lay out the facts, the story suddenly looks very different from the viral social media version. And I want to mention right off the top that there will be a blog post on www.neighborontheleft.com for this topic, and it will include sources. So let's start with the basics. The agreement that people are referring to is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, usually shortened to JCPOA. It was negotiated in 2015 between Iran and 6 countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China. Now, notice something important here. This was not the United States or President Obama cutting a solo deal with Iran. It was a multinational nuclear agreement negotiated out over several years. And the goal of the deal was simple: to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. That's it. Not regime change, not friendship, not trust, just nuclear containment. Under the agreement, Iran had to make some major concessions. They reduced their stockpile of enriched uranium by about 98%. They dismantled thousands of centrifuges used to enrich uranium. They redesigned a nuclear reactor so it could not produce weapons-grade plutonium. They allowed international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor their nuclear facilities. And those inspectors were given access that they had never had before. In exchange for those restrictions, the international community agreed to lift certain economic sanctions that had been placed on Iran. That's the deal. That's the whole basic framework. Restrictions on nuclear activity in exchange for sanction relief. Which brings us to the part that tends to get, well, let's say, creatively interpreted. If you listen to certain politicians or cable news personalities, you'll often hear something like this. Obama gave Iran $150 billion. And that number gets thrown around a lot. And it sounds enormous because it is enormous. But here's the question that somehow gets skipped. Where did the money come from? Did Congress approve a $150 billion check to Iran? Did the Treasury Department open up the American piggy bank? Did taxpayers suddenly start funding the Iranian government? No. What actually happened is far less dramatic. For years, because of international sanction, Iran's own money was frozen in foreign banks. Oil revenues, foreign exchange reserves, assets held overseas. Those funds belonged to Iran, but sanctions prevented them from accessing the money. So when the nuclear deal lifted the sanctions, Iran gained access to some of its own frozen assets. Now, let me repeat that because this is the part that somehow gets lost in the political shouting. It was Iran's money, not American money, not taxpayer money, their money. This is a little bit like if your bank account gets frozen during a legal dispute, and then when the dispute is resolved, the bank doesn't give you money. They just let you access your own money again. That's basically what happened. But saying Iran regained access to some of its previously frozen assets after sanctions were lifted is not nearly as exciting as shouting, Obama gave them $150 billion. So guess which version spread faster? Now, let's talk about the image that really lit the political world on fire, not to mention social media, the pallets of cash. This is the part where the critics say, see, plane loads of money, that's proof. And here's the twist. That part actually did happen. But context matters a lot in this story, as with most things. Back in the 1970s, Iran was still ruled by the Shah, and he was a close ally of the United States. Iran paid the U.S. about $400 million for military equipment. Then, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution happened. The Shah was overthrown. The new Iranian government was hostile to the United States, and the weapons were never delivered. But the United States kept the $400 million. This dispute went into an international arbitration tribunal in The Hague, and it sat there for decades. Not months, not years, decades. Eventually, the U.S. government decided it made sense to settle the case rather than risk losing in arbitration and potentially paying even more money. So, in 2016, the United States agreed to pay $400 million, that was the principal, and about $1.3 billion in interest. Total settlement, $1.7 billion. Now here's where the pallets come in. Because Iran was still largely cut off from the international banking system, the money could not be transferred electronically the way it would normally be done. So the United States delivered the first $400 million in foreign currency, euros, Swiss francs, other non-U.S. currencies. And yes, those bills were physically stacked on wooden pallets, because that's what happens when you move large quantities of cash and you can't do it electronically. You put them on pallets. That image, that became political gold. Photos of pallets, stories about planes. Suddenly, the narrative becomes, look, Obama is flying cash to Iran. Except the money wasn't taxpayer funds. It was a legal settlement over money Iran had paid for weapons nearly 40 years earlier. Now, to be fair, there is one part of the story that critics seized on, and it's understandable why. The settlement payment happened the same day Iran released several American prisoners. The Obama administration insisted the two issues were separate negotiations, but they also acknowledged that the payment wasn't released until the Americans were safely on their way home, which critics said made it ransom. Supporters said it was simply good negotiating practice. Reasonable people can debate that part, I suppose. But again, that debate is very different from the claim that the United States gifted Iran billions in taxpayer cash. So if the facts are this clear, why does this myth keep coming back? Because political narratives are sticky. Once a story becomes useful to someone's political argument, it tends to stick around long after the details have been corrected. And to be fair, the optics of pallets of cash were terrible. They looked terrible. If you were designing a scenario that would generate conspiracy theories, you could hardly come up with a better one than this. But there's a difference between bad optics and bad facts. And in this case, the facts are actually pretty straightforward. Most of the money people referenced was Iran's own frozen assets.